There comes a moment in every life when something invisible inside begins to fracture. It is not the sharp sting of sadness, nor the hot surge of anger. It is something quieter, heavier. Something that feels as if the soul itself has grown weary of carrying burdens that were never its own. It is the exhaustion of wearing masks for too long, of holding together relationships that only consume, of squeezing into roles that were designed by others, not by you. Carl Jung described this moment as the beginning of individuation, the point where the true self finally stirs beneath the rubble of expectation. It is not a loud declaration. There is no trumpet call, no inscription on the calendar declaring that today you will reclaim your life. Instead, it comes silently, often in the middle of despair, as though the unconscious has been waiting patiently for the precise moment when you can no longer resist. It is never when you think you are ready. It arrives late at night when you whisper promises that tomorrow will be different, when you try to bargain with your own fatigue. You tell yourself that if you endure just a little longer, if you change, if you try harder, perhaps the emptiness in your chest will finally lift. But the weight never disappears. The pieces never fit. And then, without ceremony, the decision is made. A quiet but absolute no more. Jung insisted this was no whim, no passing storm of emotion, but a profound call from the psyche itself, a silent scream that has been waiting for years to be heard. To ignore it is to keep drifting in a life that feels increasingly alien. To accept it is to begin a journey of no return, because once you dare to walk toward authenticity, once you shed what no longer belongs to you, the old self begins to dissolve. In its place, someone unfamiliar emerges, someone stronger, more conscious, undeniably more real. And yet, what many fail to grasp is that this moment is not an act of rebellion. It is not destruction for its own sake. It is, in truth, an act of self-love, the purest one imaginable, the end of self-abandonment, the beginning of wholeness. History has recorded countless variations of this same breaking point. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus wrote that true freedom begins the moment we stop living by the opinions of others. Medieval mystics describe the dark night of the soul as the hour when one is stripped bare of illusions before encountering the divine within. And in nearly every culture, myths of rebirth, from the phoenix rising from its ashes to the hero descending into the underworld, speak of the same transformation. One must fall apart before one can rise anew. But here is the paradox. If the breaking point is the doorway to liberation, why do so many resist it? Why, even when we know something is killing us slowly, do we cling so desperately to it? Jung answered with unsettling clarity, because our identity has been built upon the very things that harm us. For years, sometimes for decades, we tell ourselves the same stories. This is just the way things are. I can't change it. Perhaps I deserve this. Maybe being unloved is better than being alone. These words sink deep into the unconscious, taking root like weeds. They become the architecture of a false reality, one in which pain feels normal, suffocating jobs feel necessary, and loveless relationships feel safer than solitude. And so we remain, trapped, exhausted, repeating cycles that do not nourish us. But the truth, as Jung warned, is that the soul never stops seeking its own evolution. When it has had enough, when silence is no longer an option, the fracture comes. This is the breaking point, the moment when life refuses to let you continue sleepwalking. And though it feels like the end, it is only the beginning. When that quiet decision arises, the decision to say no more, it feels as though it comes from somewhere beyond reason. It is not an impulsive act. It is not rebellion for rebellion's sake. Jung believed it was a call from the unconscious itself, a deep summons that cannot be silenced. It is the psyche's way of demanding truth after years of suffocation beneath roles, fears, and inherited expectations. This is why the moment feels irreversible. Once the unconscious speaks, there is no pretending you did not hear it. To ignore it is to sink further into despair. To obey it is to step onto a path that will reshape your life forever. It is the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the long, painful, but necessary journey of becoming who you truly are. But this threshold is terrifying, because to cross it is to leave behind the familiar. You are not simply walking away from a relationship, a job, or a place. You are walking away from a version of yourself, the self that endured, tolerated, and conformed. That self may have been built on pain, but it was also built on certainty, on predictability. Letting go feels like dying, because in a sense, it is. History gives us countless mirrors for this truth. The Buddha left his palace not because he hated it, but because he could no longer silence the knowledge that life within its walls was an illusion. Dante's Divine Comedy begins with a single line. In the middle of the journey of our life, I found myself within a dark wood, for the right way was lost. That dark wood is the call of the unconscious. The Hebrew prophets, the desert hermits, even modern revolutionaries all tell of a breaking point where the inner voice could no longer be denied. And yet, when this call arrives, it rarely feels like liberation. It feels like chaos. You question yourself. You wonder if you've made the right choice. Fear whispers that you have betrayed something sacred by daring to say enough. The mind clings to what is known, while the soul pushes toward the unknown. This is the battle Jung described, the struggle between the comfort of the old and the uncertainty of the new. For most people, this is the place where they retreat. The weight of fear becomes unbearable, and they run back into the arms of the very things they wanted to escape. The job they swore they'd leave, the partner they swore they'd outgrown, the silence they swore they'd break, all reclaimed, all endured once again. Not because they truly belong there, but because the void feels unbearable. But those who endure, those who listen to the unconscious rather than drown it out, begin to notice something extraordinary. Slowly, quietly, fragments of energy that had been scattered return. Choices, once clouded in fog, begin to clear. For the first time in years, maybe decades, there is a spark of life that feels authentic, unborrowed, unmasked. The decision to say no more is not an ending. It is the first trembling step into authenticity. It is the soul's declaration, I will not betray myself any longer. And though the road ahead will demand everything, courage, honesty, and a willingness to be broken open, it also holds a promise greater than fear. Because when you answer the call of the unconscious, you are not walking into emptiness. You are walking into yourself. Once the decision is made, once you whisper that quiet no more, something stirs in the depths. Jung called it the shadow, the hidden reservoir of everything we were told to repress, the desires that embarrassed us, the rage we buried, the grief we swallowed, the instincts we were told were too much. All of it waits below the surface, and the moment you begin walking toward authenticity, the shadow awakens. The tragedy is that ignoring it does not make it disappear. On the contrary, the shadow leaks into daily life in disguised forms. It appears in the relationships we repeat, even though they hurt us. It shows up in patterns of self-sabotage, in unexplained anxiety, in restless nights where something feels wrong, but we cannot name it. The shadow becomes the architect of our suffering, not because it is evil, but because it has been silenced. Think of it like this. A child who is never heard will eventually start screaming. The unconscious works the same way. Every piece of yourself you rejected, every instinct you suppressed, begins demanding attention. It disguises itself in partners who mirror your wounds, in jobs that feel like cages, in friendships that drain instead of nurture. You tell yourself these are accidents, but they are not. They are your shadow trying to speak. Jung was clear. We do not become whole by chasing light. We become whole by facing darkness. And this truth is as old as humanity itself. In ancient Greece, the myth of Persephone told of a young maiden dragged into the underworld, forced to confront what lay beneath. In Egypt, the dead traveled through night's perilous halls before they could rise with the sun. The hero's journey, across cultures, always requires a descent, a confrontation with what we fear most. Modern life, though more polished, is no different. When you say no more, you are essentially dragging the shadow into daylight. Suddenly, you cannot ignore the anger you have carried for years. Suddenly, you see how much of your life has been shaped by fear rather than love. The illusion begins to collapse, and with it, the false self you once mistook for truth. And here lies the painful paradox. This confrontation feels like destruction, but in reality, it is liberation. For the first time, you are no longer a prisoner of unconscious patterns. You are beginning to see them clearly. Every toxic cycle, every false belief, every moment of self-betrayal, they are no longer hidden. They are visible, and what is visible can be changed. But this awakening does not arrive gently. It drags with it all the emotions you tried to bury: shame, guilt, fear, rage. At times it feels like drowning, yet what you are really experiencing is your own wholeness returning. The shadow is not your enemy, it is the missing half of your soul. The moment the shadow awakens, the journey deepens. What comes next is the confrontation itself, the decision to look at what you have avoided your entire life. And that is where the real transformation begins. To awaken the shadow is one thing. To face it is another. The moment you decide to live without illusions, the shadow steps forward like a long-forgotten figure demanding recognition. It does not whisper, it confronts. Suddenly you see in brutal clarity the habits you once excused, the compromises you once called normal, the relationships you once clung to as proof of belonging. The veil is torn, and what remains is raw, unfiltered truth. But truth, as Jung warned, is rarely comfortable. To face the shadow is to wrestle with everything you were taught to bury. The anger you suppressed in order to be nice. The ambition you muted because it threatened others. The grief you silenced to avoid making people uncomfortable. All of it now floods back, demanding not just to be seen, but to be integrated. This confrontation feels like death. And in a symbolic sense, it is. Myths across the world understood this. In Sumerian legend, the goddess Inanna descended into the underworld, stripped of every garment, every jewel, until nothing remained but her naked self. In Christian tradition, the crucifixion was followed by 3 days of darkness before resurrection. In indigenous rites of passage, the initiate would endure trials that symbolized the end of one identity and the painful birth of another. The shadow is your underworld. It is the personal descent you must endure. To run from it is to remain fragmented. To face it is to begin the process of rebirth. And so the battle begins, not against an external enemy, but against the inner forces that beg you to retreat into the old, familiar life. Fear arrives first. What if I made the wrong choice? What if I am not strong enough? What if I end up alone? Nostalgia soon follows, painting the past in golden tones, showing you only the tender moments and erasing the wounds that brought you here. These are not truths, they are defenses. They are the mind's desperate attempt to restore order, to drag you back into what it can predict, even if that predictability is misery. But transformation has never come without trial. The ancients understood this, which is why their myths were not stories of comfort, but of descent into chaos. Facing the shadow is chaos. It is grief, fear, doubt, and pain, but it is also the crucible in which authenticity is forged. Jung called this process dying in order to be reborn. The old identity, built on compliance, silence, and fear, cannot survive the encounter with truth. It crumbles, and in its ruins, a new self begins to emerge. This is why it hurts so deeply. You are not simply letting go of a job or a person. You are letting go of an entire version of yourself. And though you may feel stripped bare, Though the path ahead looks uncertain, there is one truth you cannot ignore. The shadow does not appear to destroy you. It appears to make you whole. This is only the beginning. The descent is underway, and the journey has no map. But within the darkness lies the seed of rebirth, and that seed is waiting for you to claim it. Something remarkable begins to happen once you confront the shadow. At first, the process feels like collapse. Fear, grief, and doubt swirl in relentless cycles. But if you resist the temptation to run back into the comfort of old patterns, a subtle shift occurs. The energy that once felt scattered, drained, or stolen begins to return. For years, perhaps without realizing it, you have been pouring out pieces of yourself into places that could never give back. Every time you tolerated disrespect, you gave away a fragment of your vitality. Every time you silenced your own truth to keep the peace, another fragment slipped away. Every time you stayed in an environment that suffocated your spirit, a little more of your inner fire dimmed. Jung described this loss as psychic depletion, the slow leaking of the soul's vitality into roles and dynamics that do not serve its growth. But when you finally say no more, when you begin the painful work of letting go, all of that energy starts to flow back. It feels almost magical. What once seemed impossible becomes clear. What once consumed you now appears small, even meaningless. It is as though the very act of reclaiming yourself unlocks a reservoir you never knew you had. A tiredness you thought was permanent begins to lift. The fog of indecision clears. You notice yourself breathing more deeply, standing more firmly, moving through the world with a subtle strength that was always yours but long buried. History is filled with echoes of this phenomenon. The Stoics spoke of ataraxia, a state of inner tranquility that arises when one refuses to waste energy on what lies beyond control. Indigenous shamans described soul retrieval rituals in which lost fragments of vitality were called back from the wounds of the past. Even in medieval Europe, monastic traditions emphasized the withdrawal from worldly distractions, not as rejection of life, but as a way of reclaiming scattered energy for the soul's higher work. To reclaim your energy is to reverse years of quiet erosion. And with this reclamation comes something deeper, clarity. Suddenly, you see the patterns for what they were. The job was not simply demanding, it was devouring. The relationship was not merely complicated, it was consuming your essence. The constant anxiety was not a personal flaw, it was the shadow crying out for attention. And as this clarity sharpens, you begin to notice something else, the return of self-respect. You no longer have the patience for crumbs of affection, for workplaces that exploit, for friendships built on one-sided effort. Not because you are bitter, but because you finally recognize your worth. This return of energy is not euphoric in the way movies portray transformation. It is quieter, steadier. It feels like standing in your own skin after years of being displaced. It feels like belonging to yourself again. Jung called this a psychic rebirth. The scattered fragments of your vitality reassemble, and you step forward not as who you were, but as someone new, someone stronger, more aware, more whole. But this is only half the story, because once this energy returns, it awakens something even more powerful. A love unlike any you have ever known. A love not sought in the eyes of another, not begged for or bargained for, but born from within, the love of self. When the fragments of your energy return, when the fog of exhaustion begins to lift, something extraordinary unfolds. Out of the ashes of what you have released emerges a force both fragile and unshakable, self-love. For years, perhaps for your entire life, love may have been something you chased outside yourself. Approval from a parent, affection from a partner, validation from friends or colleagues. You were taught that love was something earned, something conditional, something that depended on being useful, agreeable, or impressive. But the love that rises after saying no more is different. It is not transactional. It is not fragile. It does not beg for permission. It is the quiet certainty that you are enough as you are. This kind of love doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives in subtler ways, when you stop explaining away red flags, when you stop accepting half-hearted gestures, when you stop justifying why crumbs should satisfy a starving soul. It is the moment you realize that the standard of your life is no longer how much you can endure, but how deeply you can respect yourself, and the effects ripple outward. Suddenly, what once felt tolerable now feels unbearable. Behaviors you once excused appear clearly for what they are: disrespect, neglect, manipulation. It feels like waking from a decades-long sleep. The world looks the same, but you see it with unfiltered eyes. Jung warned that such awakenings can be disorienting. To recognize your worth means you can no longer hide from what dishonors it. Yet this disorientation is also liberation. For the first time, you are no longer trapped in cycles of self-betrayal. You no longer cling to relationships or roles that diminish you. Instead, you stand rooted in a love that requires no external validation. Cultures across history have revered this shift. The ancient Greeks inscribed at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, "Know thyself." In Eastern traditions, enlightenment is often described as remembering what was always within. Even mystics of the Middle Ages spoke of the divine spark at the center of the soul, waiting to be uncovered beneath layers of shame and fear. What they all point toward is the same truth. When you return to yourself, you discover a love deeper than anything the external world can provide. This birth of self-love does not make life easier in the superficial sense. It does not erase hardship or loneliness, but it transforms how you move through them. You are no longer begging life to prove your worth. You already know it. And that knowledge changes everything. It changes the way you speak, the way you carry your body, the way you set boundaries without apology. And perhaps most importantly, it changes the kind of people and experiences you allow into your world. Because when you respect yourself, life begins to mirror that respect back to you. Yet there is still a trial ahead. For once you claim this self-love, the universe tests its strength in the most difficult way imaginable, through solitude. The first test of self-love is not abundance. It is emptiness. When you let go of what no longer serves you, when you finally say enough, a void opens. The relationships, habits, and identities that once consumed you are gone, and in their place remains silence. This silence is terrifying. The familiar, no matter how painful, at least gave shape to your days. Now the space feels unbearable. Doubts creep in. What if I made the wrong decision? What if I am destined to be alone? What if nothing better comes? The mind scrambles to restore the old patterns, replaying memories with a golden glow, making you miss what you know deep down was never truly yours. Jung understood this fear intimately. He wrote that transformation always requires a period of chaos before clarity arrives. The unconscious resists change, pushing you to retreat into the predictable, even if the predictable is suffering. That is why solitude feels like punishment, when in truth it is initiation. For centuries, cultures have recognized this crucible. In tribal rites of passage, initiates were sent into the wilderness alone, stripped of comfort, forced to face fear before returning as adults. Monks and mystics withdrew into deserts, caves, or monasteries, confronting the abyss of silence in search of deeper truths. Even modern psychology acknowledges that the willingness to endure solitude is one of the clearest signs of inner strength. What makes solitude so difficult is that it confronts you with yourself. Without the distractions of toxic relationships or empty routines, you come face to face with the voice within, the voice you silenced for years. At first, that voice may speak in fear or grief. But if you stay, if you resist the urge to escape into the first distraction that appears, something shifts. The silence that once felt like exile begins to reveal itself as sacred space. This void is not a punishment. It is a clearing. It is the ground upon which a new self can take root. But only if you resist the temptation to fill it too quickly. To grasp at the nearest relationship, the nearest job, the nearest source of validation, is to plant the same seeds of suffering all over again. Instead, the challenge is to sit in the emptiness and listen, to let the silence strip away the noise until only truth remains. And in that truth, clarity begins to emerge. You begin to see who you are without the masks, without the roles, without the weight of what others demanded of you. This is why solitude is not a curse, but a crucible. It burns away illusions. It demands patience, courage, and trust. But in its fire, the authentic self takes shape. And once that self is born, nothing, no fear, no manipulation, no false comfort, can take it away again. The question is, will you endure the silence long enough to discover what waits on the other side? If you endure the silence, if you resist the urge to fill the void with old patterns, something astonishing begins to happen. Slowly, the external world starts to mirror your internal transformation. Jung called this phenomenon synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that reveal an unseen alignment between the psyche and the world. You begin to notice it in subtle ways. A conversation with a stranger that speaks directly to what you are going through. An unexpected opportunity that appears just as you are ready for it. The right book falling into your hands at the right moment. To the rational mind, these are chance events, but to the soul that has reclaimed its power, they feel like confirmation. You are on the right path. This is not magic in the fairy tale sense. It is simply resonance. When you were broken inside, you attracted relationships and situations that reinforced your brokenness. But now, vibrating at a different frequency, you call forth something new. People who once seemed compatible no longer feel right, not because you judge them, but because you no longer share the same energy. The dynamics you once tolerated now feel unbearable, not because you are too demanding, but because your soul refuses to shrink back into smallness. This is the birth of new standards. For the first time, you stop asking, "Am I asking for too much?" Instead, you ask, "Why did I ever accept so little?" The shift is profound. Where once you explained away disrespect, you now see it for what it is. Where once you begged for crumbs, you now recognize they were never enough. Where once you believed that love meant sacrifice, you now understand that love begins with self-respect. But this is also where temptation lurks. The past does not vanish easily. Old patterns will try to reappear, sometimes disguised as something new. A familiar relationship may return, promising that this time it will be different. A job that once drained you may tempt you with security. Nostalgia may whisper that perhaps you were too harsh, that maybe things weren't so bad. This is the moment of testing. Many falter here, not because they are weak, but because the old feels safe. Yet safety built on self-betrayal is not safety at all. It is a cage. To step back into it is to undo the very progress your soul fought to claim. Jung warned that the shadow, if not fully integrated, will project itself outward, pulling you back into cycles of illusion. Awareness is the only shield. To see clearly, to recognize manipulation for what it is, to refuse the old disguises, that is the essence of strength. The truth is simple, though not easy. Anything that demands you betray your peace does not deserve a place in your life. Attachment is not love. Fear is not loyalty. Familiarity is not truth. And so the task of this stage is not merely to embrace new standards, but to hold them, even when the past comes knocking. Because if you do, the synchronicities multiply, the path clears, and life begins to align in ways you once thought impossible. The world is responding to the new you. The question is whether you will trust it. There comes a point on this path when the change is no longer fragile, no longer something that can be undone. It is the moment you realize there is no going back, not because you refuse, but because the person you once were simply no longer exists. Jung taught that every true awakening expands the psyche, and what has expanded cannot shrink again. You cannot unsee what you have seen. You cannot unknow your worth once you have felt it in your bones. To attempt to return would be to suffocate inside an identity that no longer fits. This realization brings a new kind of peace. You no longer waste energy proving yourself, explaining your worth, or bargaining for scraps of affection. You no longer measure your life against the expectations of others. Instead, you live from a foundation of self-love so solid that it becomes unshakable. And when you live this way, something unexpected happens. People who once manipulated you sense they no longer have power. They may try to return, not because they have changed, but because they recognize that you have. They are bewildered when guilt no longer chains you, when old tactics no longer work. For the first time, they see in you what was always there, your power. And now, finally, you see it too. This does not mean life becomes free of struggle. Challenges remain, but they are no longer battles for your survival. They are choices you face with clarity, not fear. You know which paths are yours and which are not. You know what deserves your energy and what does not. And in this knowing lies the greatest victory: freedom. This transformation is irreversible because it is not about changing into someone else. It is about returning to who you were always meant to be. The masks have fallen, the illusions burned away, and what remains is authentic, undeniable, unbreakable you. History has always celebrated such awakenings. The phoenix that rises from its ashes is never the same as before. The hero who returns from the underworld is forever transformed. And so it is with you. You are no longer waiting for the world to grant you permission to live. You have already claimed it. Now the task is to live this truth fully, to walk forward not as someone seeking, but as someone embodying. To let your presence itself be a reminder to others that renewal is possible, that self-love is not a dream, that wholeness can be found on the other side of courage. And as you share this journey, as you speak these truths, you become more than just an individual who chose themselves. You become a signal fire, guiding others through their own darkness. This is how transformation multiplies, through courage, through authenticity, through the refusal to ever again betray the self. The change is complete. The path ahead is clear. And now, the only thing left is to live.